Hi, welcome everyone to today's talk on the census innovations during COVID-19. I am Teresa Acuña. I'm Associate Director of Democratic Governance Programs at the Ash Center. And if this is one of your first times joining our events, the Ash Center is one of 12 research think tanks at the Harvard Kennedy School. And among the many things we do, we focus on bridging academia and practice to improve our democracy. We bring this conversation today as part, or the second part of our census series on behalf of the Harvard Votes Challenge, a nonpartisan innovative initiative that strives to build a civic culture at Harvard University. I want to start us off with some housekeeping announcements. First, I want to thank you in advance for your patience for any technical glitches we may encounter today. To minimize interruptions, the audience is muted, but we encourage you to use the chat box for questions or comments. We will dedicate the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time together for discussion and questions. But if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you should feel free to use the chat box to send them and we'll answer at the end. This event is being recorded and could be found at the Ash Center website and Harvard Votes Challenge website for future viewing. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce John Joanino, a current MPP student at Harvard Kennedy School and formerly served on the California Governor's Commission for the Census and Census Policy Advocacy Network at the Advancement Project California. Welcome, John. You can take it away.
Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It is very encouraging to see that people are still engaged in the census, especially amidst a pandemic. As Teresa mentioned, I previously served on the California Governor's Commission for the Census, and that's how I met two of our incredible guest speakers who I have the honor of introducing right now. First, Kyla Fullenwider. Kyla Fullenwider formerly served as the U.S. Census Bureau's Chief Innovation Officer. She's currently a Data and Digital Fellow at Georgetown University's Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. She was previously a fellow at the Kennedy School Shorenstein Center and has a diverse portfolio of work at the intersection of civic innovation, entrepreneurship, and social design. And our second guest speaker is Ditas Katague. Ditas is the Director of California's Complete Count Team. She also previously served as the chair of the U.S. Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. She's an expert on multi-ethnic outreach and civic engagement, and she has led California's census efforts since the start of the millennium. And she's also a yoga instructor, which I think is pretty awesome. So at this point, I'll turn it over to our guest speakers to briefly introduce themselves, and we can start with Kyla.
Thanks, John, so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, even remotely, as we're all adapting to this new environment. And I'm very excited to have this conversation today because, you know, as many of you know, the Census Bureau has been planning for years for the 2020 census. But perhaps the one thing they did not plan for, and we did not plan for, was a global pandemic. And so I think the conversation is critical and an important one to be having right now. So thanks so much for inviting me.
Awesome. Ditas?
Great. Thanks, John and Teresa. I'm very excited to be there. It's funny because they changed the words to the millennial. That makes me sound, you know, not as old as I look of doing this work. Very excited to be here. We were talking, we were prepping for this, that none of us had imagined where we're at. I'm glad to say that over here in California, we're keeping pace with the country in terms of response rates, but we need to keep it up. And you know, this has extended, so it's going to be an ultra marathon, not a marathon. And we're about 50% of our households here in California have responded. And we're doing a lot of innovative things here with some pretty robust funding, which has been super helpful. And that's funding from the state and the governor. I have served under 4 governors, and so they've been of both parties. And so I just want to stress that the census is not a partisan effort. It really is bipartisan, or really should be nonpartisan and non-political. And it should be a very inclusive event. So looking forward to answering questions, and so glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you both for tuning in, and to all of our attendees today, wherever you are tuning in from the world, we hope that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. So before going into our discussion questions and Q&A, we did want to offer some background on the census and why it's important, especially given the current state of the pandemic. So as you all may know, the census is required by the Constitution. The decennial count determines billions in dollars of federal funding for local services, including healthcare, schools, roads, and emergency preparedness planning. It's also crucial to accurate population data and congressional representation. So at its core, the census is about representation, money, and power. And this is where we're at today. These are statistics from the US Census Bureau's Response Outreach Area Mapper. As of yesterday, about half of the country has responded to the census. And as you see, Massachusetts is at about the same pace. This is something we encourage you all to take a look into. You can go on the Census Bureau's website and can look directly at the response rates in your community, everything from your congressional district down to your town. And as mentioned, none of us could have anticipated the impact that a global pandemic would have had on our decennial census. So these are just some of the headlines that have been making their way around the public. And also, you know, the census has never been the most flashiest thing, but it's one of the most important cornerstones of our democracy. So we wanted to take this opportunity to first extend our gratitude to all the frontline workers who are risking their lives to keep people safe and healthy during this pandemic. And this is actually a PSA that the Census Bureau released this week.
They are the heroes, the helpers, working on the front lines. And here's one small way that you can help them in return. Complete your 2020 census today. 2020 census data helps communities plan funding for hospitals, clinics, and emergency services across the country. An accurate count helps public health officials know who is at risk, and first responders identify the resources they need to protect our communities. Complete your census at 2020census.gov and help shape our future.
So this PSA really underscores that the 2020 census is the statistical backbone to emergency preparedness and healthcare. So it's our turn to respond. One of the questions is, how do we pivot our outreach strategies now that much of it has to be done virtually and online? So I want to show a couple examples of the creative work that's being done to encourage, motivate folks to fill out the census. How do we reach people and encourage them to fill out the census even while social distancing? I want to turn it over to Teresa right now to provide some background on the guidance that Harvard has provided to our students about how to respond.
Sure. So I just want to echo a lot of the sentiment of how unexpected the pandemic was, and even the Harvard community, quick pivot of how we're communicating with our community of how to respond. So for those students that are living on campus or apartment housing that is owned by Harvard, you will be counted from the institution. So you don't have to fill out a form. But if you are faculty, staff, or administrators, or students that are renting off campus, you will have to respond. And you should have received a postcard or some type of mailing in the past few weeks. But there's a good chance that you may not be in your actual location in Cambridge. You might have moved home to ride this period out. So when you do reply, you want to make sure that you're using your Cambridge address.
Awesome, thank you. And here are a couple other examples of how trusted messengers and influencers are helping get the word out. So we have Tom Hanks, Selena Gomez, Cardi B, one of my favorite artists, and Jonathan Van Ness from Queer Eye for the Straight Guy with one of our speakers, Ditas. So Ditas, would you be able to share a little bit more about your conversation with Jonathan?
Yes, so for those of you that are JVN fans, he is just as fabulous in person as he is on TV. He's super smart and super interested, and really he focused in on really the social justice piece of it. And so we were really pleased. This was back in August that this was arranged by a few really key folks at the national level who got this going on for us. And we did a great podcast. And then he continued on April 1st to really promote the census as well. And I think as this goes on, he'll probably reach out again and say, hey, how can I help? Especially like maybe right before non-response follow-up where people start knocking on doors. But people this time around, again, this is my third, are so much more engaged and interested because I think people really understand with the environment of our nation right now, how important it is for everyone to be seen and counted. So it was fun.
Awesome. One of the things I really appreciate about this is the simplicity of the messaging. So 10 questions, 10 minutes, billions of dollars to shape our future. And here Cardi B mentions, don't let this virus distract you. We need to be counted. So I do think it's awesome that we're able to get people from all over the country to step it up.
It's actually 9 questions now.
Oh, 9 questions. All right.
10 in the past. So they got it down to 9.
Cool. Here's actually another example from just a couple of days ago. The city of Philadelphia sent out an emergency text message to all of its residents saying, fill out the 2020 census, and that will help with COVID-19 recovery. So we want to pose this as a question. Is this something that can be replicated across cities in the country? Or Kyla or Ditas, either of you?
Well,
Right.
go ahead first, Kyla, and then I'll answer what we're doing here at the state.
Sure. So I think there are conversations happening all over the country right now. I think we've seen, I think dozens of cities now send out similar types of messages, including New York and others in California. It's unclear if this will be widely adopted at this point. I know there have been other conversations with the telecoms as well to see about the possibility of leveraging their reach. But it seems like the local city messaging really does have the most impact, because what we've seen from message testing research for the last several years is that one of the most important messages that people need to hear is how the census impacts their community. So getting that message from your city, from your local government, seems to have a greater impact than a national message.
Awesome.
So I just want to comment that we've been really focused, obviously we've had to pivot, and we're using digital media strategically with just, I don't want to say on the free side, but all of our state departments are really involved. And so I really encourage folks across the country that, their city departments or state departments, their reach into our hardest to count populations is huge. So we're going to places and doing sort of above the fold on the websites with our employment development, because a lot of folks are unemployed right now or needing benefits, our taxation agencies, our public health departments, people are going there, our transportation departments, and our call centers, because people are calling. Collectively alone, they hit about 2.5 million people per month. And so their social media hits are over 1 million without even reposting, and mailings are over 32 million collectively. So, I mean, there's a lot of free ways or inexpensive ways to reach folks even throughout. Because, when we talk about using the emergency system, it's for emergencies. And so I kind of hesitate a little bit. That's our conversation about, do we want to use this for this when we have, millions of other ways to reach out to folks in a sort of targeted way, people who are, using services. So really utilizing, for us here in California, our efforts are really meant to reach the hardest of the hardest to count here in California, because it's so diverse and there's so many different languages. And we use the trusted messengers. And then we are supporting what the US Census Bureau is doing in terms of kind of like that beautiful ad that you saw in terms of making everyone sort of feel included, kind of more of a broader national level. And then we're really here focused on California's hardest to count, which is about 11 million folks, which is, for those of you that aren't familiar with California, it's larger than the state of Georgia. And those are the folks that we consider hard to count that we're really trying to reach.
Absolutely, that's insightful. What I'm hearing from both of you is that the resonance of a localized message is what can really motivate people to fill out the census, and that state and local governments can pull all strings with respect to the digital touch points that people already interact.
Yeah, and I'll just also add, and I think Ditas can speak to this even in more detail than I can, but a lot of the questionnaire assistance centers that were being rolled out really were relying on a lot of public infrastructure that's now shut down, including the public library systems, among other resources. And so cities and local governments are needing to get very creative and think about how they can bring a lot of that infrastructure online. And I think this text messaging emergency response is one of the ways that they're pivoting to address that. issue.
That's a good point, Kyla. We had almost over 3,000 QACs, questionnaire assistance centers, that were in the neighborhoods, that were at trusted messengers, whether they're at clinics or at schools or libraries, and kiosks that were out there where people go. And all of that has been, we can't do it. So we're really trying to pivot, as you mentioned, to digitally go there, both with our community-based organizations, but also on the government side. So I just wanted to be clear out here in California, it's a partnership. We have partnerships with over 120 community-based organizations, and then they have sub-partners, and we have targeted on the map and using the data. So I know all of you guys are probably very data intensive to target our efforts. Like, I'm not gonna do outreach in Beverly Hills, right? But we're gonna target the areas that need it most, whether that's South Central LA or areas that have super hard to count communities that have, multi-unit, limited English proficient. So we're trying to target our efforts there, which is a lot harder.
Absolutely. Teresa, would you like to add anything?
A lot of like what my thinking is around this kind of rapid response from your city, a text message. We know that a lot of hard to count communities are mobile dependent. So we know that most likely they have a cell phone. In what ways do you think that there has to be, so that our viewers today can put the pressure on their local municipalities to use creative information dissemination channels? Is that, do we contact our state? Do we contact our local? How can we activate our viewers to think kind of outside the box in reaching these hard to count communities?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think
I'll just add one piece here, and then I think Ditas can speak more to the state level. I think there are a lot of civil society groups right now that are looking at sort of peer-to-peer messaging, text messaging, phone banking, those kinds of things that you might normally see with GOTV type activities. But again, pivoting their, in-person door knocking type efforts online, training up their staff to do more digital organizing. But almost anyone, whether it's a faith-based community, a school, or any community really, can leverage text messages in that sort of peer-to-peer way where you're reminding your community members to participate in the census. I think that's really important to remember. A lot of the faith-based community activities that had been planned previously were things that were happening kind of after service or connected to services. And so now that services are being translated or transferred online, how can, for example, congregation, collectively take the census together after their online service, those sorts of things. So I think it's both at the state and local government level, but then I think there's also quite a bit of room for civil society to get creative as well.
Absolutely. And I think that, as students, if you're back in your community at home, you're at the Kennedy School, so reach out. You can reach out to the mayors. You can reach out to the city council members to say, hey, I know you got your hands full with this, but this is just important. There's plenty of really great talking points out there, and we can send those websites to John and he can push those out. You can go high tech and then you can go low tech. Our partners have had to pivot. We have about $90 million of funding down on the ground for these organizations. And we're pivoting back to, lawn signs. Many of them are using some of the swag that they had, shirts and collateral handouts, bags, you saw those bags, and they're dropping them off at emergency food, distribution sites. And they're using those bags to actually, when people come and get it, so they've got the census messaging on it. It's stuff with the census, collateral that we had ordered for all the events that we were going to have. I even saw a really innovative thing where one of our first 5 partners took one of the t-shirts that census and she made it into a face mask. And so you could actually see it with census. So there's really innovative things that are going on, but we can't go to places where they gather, but we know where people are going right now. They're going to convenience stores, they're going to drugstores, they're going to grocery stores, they're going to emergency food banks and food pickup. These are areas that we can direct, some of the energy to say, let's put some information out there, that low tech kind of way to create that awareness. And also there's things that if families are looking for, they got kids that are bored at home waiting to do online. There's coloring books. There's all kinds of great educational material that parents can use to keep their kids busy and also get educated about the census.
Awesome, thank you. For our attendees, we want to put up this slide to just give a snapshot of some of the operational changes that the Census Bureau announced this week. The main takeaway being that the self-response phase has been extended to October 31st. So there is time to reach out to our loved ones in our community to let them know that the census is something that we need to do right now. And this pivots into our next conversation about digital preparedness. So this is the first census in our country's history that can be completed online. And I want to turn this over to Kyla, who authored both of these reports, one of them coming out of the Shorenstein Center, to talk to us a little bit more about digital preparedness.
Thanks, John. And as we were sort of joking about on the call just before, I was looking at my paper where I've actually, laid out 2020 challenges. And the one thing that I didn't include was global pandemic on that list. So, for as many challenges as the 2020 census has already had, I don't know that any of us were prepared for this. If you recall, the big topic of the day around census for the last year or so, actually more than that, was the addition of a citizenship question on the census, which was subsequently, is now not on there. So that feels like, light years ago that conversation was happening. But to your point, it is the first, what the Bureau calls digital first census, not a digital census, but digital first census. And what they mean by that is that they are pushing everyone to respond online first, right? So there's still the paper form that everyone can use and respond on the paper form if that's their preference. And then of course there's the telephone option as well, which I think is actually a really great resource for people to know about, because a lot of the harder to count communities, rural areas, tribal regions, et cetera, can have connectivity issues. And especially in this period where our digital infrastructure is being taxed, the phone option is a good one. I say that with a caveat that there have been reported pretty significant wait times as people are calling in. But I anticipate that is going to be resolved by the Bureau as they're sort of pivoting some of their call centers to be able to work remotely, et cetera, et cetera. But a few things that remain in terms of digital preparedness. And when I wrote my papers, my audience was largely local governments, in particular municipalities, because I think at the end of the day, they're really the ones on the first line, they're on the front line of ensuring a good count and end up feeling the repercussions of a count that is not fair or accurate. And so a couple of the things that I pointed out in my paper and have had subsequent work on include sort of the rise of mis and disinformation. As we've seen that happen across the board, we know that the census is not immune from that. If there's any sort of strange good news in all of this, it's that it appears that the disinformation and misinformation around the census is not quite spiking in the way that we thought it might around the April 1st date and as the census is ramping up. And a big part of that is just that as the census was going online March 12th and then Census Day April 1st, the world was all eyes on COVID. And so we do anticipate that the misinformation and disinformation could still be an issue, but fortunately, we've been able to sort of keep a good eye on it to date. That being said, I think for local governments, civil society groups, and others, it's definitely something they want to be paying attention to and make sure that they're prepared to respond to appropriately. And we talk about some of the ways to do that in the paper. Data privacy and security is still, still something we're looking at. I think the Bureau to date has I think they've been pretty resilient. The systems everything's been working, which is great, knock on wood. And a lot of the concerns we had about data privacy and security were connected to sort of some of the, installations and sort of hardware that was going to be out in the world, at libraries and at kiosks and those sorts of things, which frankly are not really an issue now. But again, something that we're still keeping an eye on, but to date has been less of a problem. So that's a good thing. And then finally, the other big sort of topic, which I think is probably of all the things that we were looking at, the one that's most relevant for the environment that we're in now, and that is the digital divide and access. Because where, a lot of the interventions that state, local governments and civil society were looking at were really around creating more access points. That often meant like public infrastructure, being able to walk into a library and take the census on the computer there, or go into a church basement and fill out the census on iPads that your church is providing, that sort of thing. And that's just no longer an option. And so for communities and populations that already had issues around the digital divide and access and disparities there, in some ways those are exacerbated by the moment that we're in right now. And so that's something that I think maybe even Ditas can speak to as well. But I think that's really where we need to bring a finer point to our work right now, is how are we expanding access, but at the same time asking people more than we even imagined to self-respond at home. And so I think there's a tension there right now that I think a lot of folks are trying to figure out. And Ditas, did you want to perhaps add to that?
Well, just that, and I love the structure. That's the way that we've been approaching it is really, if you look at, there's the barriers, right? Because we want people to act. They have structural barriers and they have motivational barriers, right? So structural barriers are like, so motivational barriers are like, I don't know what it is. I don't really care. I don't know how it impacts the community, right? So there's a lot of media out there that's trying to do that education, a lot of messaging. But structural barriers is a little bit kind of under the radar screen. And it really is about what you talked about, which is, yeah, I can be motivated to do it, but if I have to wait on the telephone for 32 minutes, I'm not going to wait because I'm burning up my minutes. If I, speak Tagalog, like my 84-year-old mother, and she got a thing to answer online, she uses her iPad, but not really well, just to FaceTime me to say, why aren't you visiting? But, how can we use that intergenerationally to help people who are limited English proficient? So now that we're distancing, can my 16-year-old call her on FaceTime and walk her through it, right? So looking at that, but so looking at motivational barriers and educational, why, do they understand why? And then uncovering what is it that's really preventing them structurally, whether it's online or on the phone or language. So yes, that's the types of things that we need to kind of dig underneath a little bit to figure out why people aren't responding real time.
Absolutely. That's very insightful. At this point, if any of you attendees have questions for our guest, we invite you to use the raise your hand feature or to use a chat box to input them, and then we'll monitor those questions. But we'll go ahead and get this started with the question that we've been here to explore the whole time is, what are the innovative responses that are needed at this moment to counter Americans during a pandemic?
I'll start just in buckets and then we can kind of like weigh in there. It's, I look at it as there's high tech and there's low tech, right? We have all this fancy stuff that we didn't have in 2010. There's, peer-to-peer texting. There's, we're on a Zoom call, for goodness sakes. There's all these cool things that have come, but you got to kind of approach it both ways, which is high tech, but low tech, which can be flying or leaving things, you know, on people's doorsteps, although they probably don't want just to see that, or going to those places like I mentioned earlier, including the food banks and the school lunch drop-offs, wearing t-shirts. Or one of our groups, they gave their t-shirts with the branding on it to all the clerks at the store. I don't know if it was a Trader Joe's or where it was. So they said, can you wear these all on, you know, Wednesday? And just gave them kind of a quick education about what it is. So everybody was sort of matching. So there's kind of that low tech stuff as well. And really having things be hyper local. Really trusted messengers are the ones that we know historically are going to get people to act, and they're going to be heard. So we're doing stuff in our clinics because the clinics are still open. We had a partnership with them and partnership with unions. So again, I would say attack it both high tech and low tech.
That's a great, I think that's a great way to think about it. And I would also add, in some ways, there are new opportunities that have come up. I mean, for as many missed opportunities as there are sort of new opportunities in that we have, you know, actually have a window of time where we have a lot of people at home online, and in some ways are easier to sort of engage in those spaces. So meeting somebody where they are, for example, you know, children under 5 remain one of the hardest account, if not, I think actually the hardest account age group. So how do we leverage the learning platforms? How do we work with school boards, platforms like Khan Academy and others to meet the parents where they are, meet teachers where they are, and help them engage, you know, young children, you know, who are at home doing, you know, taking classes and homeschool. I also feel like there is a deepened sense of responsibility among everyone in the country now to do what we can to limit sort of direct contact and sending enumerators out into the field, which is, you know, will happen, the non-response follow-up, which reaches most of the hard-to-count communities, will start in earnest in August. I think that there really needs to be a sort of secondary campaign where we're really, and as you pointed out, John, earlier, some of the Census Bureau advertisements and messaging are adapting to this, but where we really sort of start to message the importance of soft response, not just for all of the old reasons, saving taxpayer dollars, et cetera, but for keeping, you know, workers safe and keeping, you know, keeping someone from knocking at your door. And we've been, you know, a group of us have been batting around an idea around ditch the door knock as a campaign, and sort of getting folks behind that, because it really, I think, you know, resonates in a different way now. And even as, you know, stay-at-home orders are lifted, we really don't know what the environment is going to be like in those weeks and months that follow. And it should also be noted that the non-response follow-up is scheduled right around the time that many epidemiologists are predicting there will be a second peak in the virus. And so, I mean, almost exactly at the same time. So like August through late October. And so right now, that's where we have the critical door knocking operation scheduled, but it's unclear what the world is going to look like at that time. And so there is a real, in some ways, public health responsibility to get folks to respond from home now. And so the messaging and the organizing really needs to incorporate that, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention also, I mean, because we mentioned the JVN, the state here in California, we've engaged heavily on the invested social media, that we have ambassadors. And I just wanted to mention a few of them. I don't have all of them, but Uriah Faber, you know, he's the fighter guy. I'm so good at this, right? Danny Trejo, if any of you guys have watched the Breaking Bad, he's from there. And then Harrison Barnes, who is an NBA player from the Kings. Kesh, who's a singer-songwriter. There's also Asian American woman who I can't recall her name right now, who does a lot of the, I've actually used her things. She has like recipes and the like of like, you know, how to cook X, Y, and Z. And so we have a whole list of them, and they're on their social platforms. So they already have eyes, and nationally, not just California wise. So we're trying to really target some of our audiences. I love the one that she does all these recipes, because if you're at home trying to figure out what to do with 60 tortillas, which I accidentally ordered online 60, you can go, and then they'll be popping up and trying to mix in these messages, because people are online and watching in all different sort of demographic, because like some of the people I don't know, because that's not my demographic. So
great. I'm gonna ask some questions from our audience. Let's see, we have Jean writes, I'm curious about the cost. Is the cost higher or lower for using new tech such as e-response?
it's actually cheaper, because with e-response, they put that sort of investment up front and it scales very easily. The most expensive thing about the enumeration count is hiring and training and deploying folks to knock on doors, because that's labor, and then now adding, you know, all the protective equipment. So the more we can get people to answer online or over the phone, the better. But e-response, totally the best cost savings. And I always like to say a 1% increase in response from California is huge. It brings up the entire national average if we can get Californians to self-respond.
Thank you. I think that's a great segue, talking about enumerators. There was earlier campaigns from the Census Bureau hiring people that will create the army of doors and census takers that will get to people's home. We know that things have shifted a lot. And Joanna Cuoto writes, are census employees still working now, even during the stay-at-home or state guidelines in Massachusetts or any other states that might find themselves in a shelter-in-place orders?
So I can answer that. They're not out in the field. So all field operations have been paused until June 1st. They recently announced this weekend that they would start up to their peak operations in the field. What headquarters and others in the offices are doing is they're continuing to track and respond and generate, you know, interest through the partners. So yes, there are no folks out in the field until they ramp up until June 1st, where they're hoping, depending on where we are with the pandemic, to be able to restart the in-field operations.
And I don't know if anybody saw this, or if I saw it in the New York Times this morning that census enumerators were being asked to, that the CDC and the Census Bureau were collaborating on a tracking project for tracing purposes, for disease tracing. I tried to find the article, I saw the headline and it disappeared. So I don't know if maybe something hasn't been confirmed, but I think that, I know that they're still paying employees right now. So all of the, you know, thousands of workers that had been hired are receiving, you know, full pay. But I do think that they've slowed the hiring process as well.
I know in our Harvard community, there's a lot of interest from students to be of service to our country during this time and wanted to sign up to be census takers. I'm sensing some apprehension from a lot of them because they don't know what safety measures the Census Bureau or the federal government might place in just keeping everyone safe. Perhaps that's providing PPE. Is there room for the state to step in and make sure that, you know, for example, California census takers will be taken care of and really thought through? What are your thoughts on that, Ditas?
That's a great question. We were in constant contact with the Census Bureau. I think we sort of forgot about what one of my major concerns was a few months ago before all this happened, which is the enumerators are really the ones at the end of the day that make sure our hardest to count folks get counted, right? Because I don't call it easy count, but if we get 60% of Californians answering, It's those 40% that are left that are more than likely, and it's just in my experience from 2000 and 2010, the ones that haven't responded for a reason. And so those door knockers, those enumerators, they need to be culturally competent to those areas where they're being deployed. They should be from that community. They should have language skills. They should really be that last round of trusted messengers. So we're using trusted messengers up front to educate and motivate, but the Census Bureau has to do their part at the very end to get 100% of our households counted, and it has to do with those enumerators. So yes, we need to keep them safe, and we are constantly asking our regional directors here, what is the makeup of the folks that you're hiring? And do they have the language skills? Are they being hired from the areas that we know that they're going to have to be in? And I encourage everyone across the nation to be asking those same questions, because it doesn't do any good to throw somebody into a neighborhood who's not from there, who, you know, isn't going to get people to open the door and answer. So, but I love that question about how can we here in California keep the U.S. Census Bureaus extra safe, and we're going to continue those conversations. So thank you for that question.
And I'll just add, so I don't have the burden that Ditas has to have to count everybody, or for that matter, our federal government. But I do think that there are at least a couple of hard to count populations that are more likely to respond to digital engagement than others. And two that we're looking at in particular are parents of children under 5 and college-age students who have been sort of disrupted and moved from campus during the COVID, I don't want to call it an evacuation, but it was something like that. And so there's a group of us looking at creating a kind of digital, and we're using this term enumerator very loosely, but digital enumerator fellowship that would really target students who, many of whom, by the way, have had their internships canceled over the summer, and give them an opportunity to engage through social media and other platforms, so meeting students where they are, TikTok and other places, and reminding students to get counted, and in particular, wanting to work with dual language students, so bilingual, who and in many cases are sort of translating technology and other government forms for their family members and friends and households. So more to come on that. We should have, hopefully we'll be able to get that program going in the next 3 to 4 weeks.
We have a couple more questions here.
Yeah, there's a great question from Phoenix, I see.
Yes.
Yeah, let's get to it. So, let's see, let me get it up. What can I do to help the census as a second grader? And I think I will attach another part of why should the census feel like a family endeavor?
Yeah, so I have a confession to make. I think that's my niece Stella.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Stella. Make sure your parents go up.
Hi, Stella.
Yeah. So I love that question.
Yes, you want to tap it?
Yeah, if there are any other second graders on there, there's so many cool things you can do, because I know you're probably sitting at home going, okay, I want to help. A couple of things. One, it is an intergenerational thing. So if you have like grandparents or folks that are kind of older generation that may not be so great on the digital stuff, you can certainly help them, because I know you're probably Zooming with them. So make sure you tell that. You can also, if you can do a TikTok, I'm not sure what grade, like if somebody would help you with that, to talk about why it's so important. There's also the U.S. Census Bureau has a Statistics in Schools program, which has really cool modules for kids for all K through 12. Here in California, we focused on, because we didn't want to duplicate what the Census Bureau was doing, we focused on 5th, 8th, 11th, and 12th grade, because those are social science, where you learn about, state history, U.S. government, U.S. history, American government. And so we have those modules. But I think if you speak another language too, you can help others. And then there's this really cool census challenge to make videos or TikToks or online digital things where you can win $10,000. And I encourage other students to do that, and we can send that link out. They extended the deadline for submissions for video and digital content till May 7th. So that's what I got.
That's awesome.
That's great. Kyla, did you have anything to add to that?
I think this is another one of those opportunities where schools can get involved, and so having your school reach out to parents and reminding them to get counted. I've seen a lot of that happening here in DC. I don't know if it's happening in other parts of the country, but ask your principal to remind everybody to get counted. Thanks, Stella. And I see someone just added the article. I'm going to see if I can get it to everybody here in the New York Times. Let's see, did it go through?
Yes.
For using census workers for contact tracing. This story just broke today, so I actually have not even had a chance to read it yet. But I think the idea there is that while there's this sort of waiting period before enumerators and census workers can go door to door, how might the CDC work with them to do some of this important work around contact tracing right now?
Absolutely. Actually, here in Boston, we actually just had an article come out that in a homeless shelter, about a fourth of the people there were tested positive and were asymptomatic. So I'm curious if either of you would be able to speak to outreach to that hard to count population that is now having to go into emergency housing in group quarters, like what is being done on the Census Bureau side, and then any supplementary efforts to reach the homeless.
So I can't speak right now to what the U.S. Census Bureau is doing. I know that their field operations to count the homeless, which would typically be the 3 days before April 1st, which includes service-based enumeration, transitory locations, and targeted non-sheltered outdoor locations. The U.S. Census Bureau has really great acronyms. That's called TINSEL. That has not been, it's been paused, obviously, and they haven't reestablished when they were going to do that. But I will say that here in California, I don't know if it gets all the way to the East Coast, but what the governor has committed to do within this COVID crisis is that he's secured hotel rooms. Mm-hmm. The state has, to house many of our people experiencing homelessness. In order to have them have a place to be. And I think the priorities are those that are diagnosed or tested positive for it. So that's a way to get folks off the streets and in an area where they can get the health care that they need. And then we can also sort of contain that spread within that population.
Okay.
Great. So I'll invite anyone else that wants to ask a question. We have about 10 minutes left. Please, you could either raise your hand or drop your question on the chat box. Great. I know, John, that you had a follow-up question. I don't know if you want to get to that.
Yeah, the last question, and thank you both again for joining us to share your insights with us, is what is one important lesson that leaders should carry forward for the next decennial census?
This is a great question. I've had several conversations about this, not just in the context of the global pandemic, but frankly, even going into the 2020 census. I think there's been sort of chatter among folks for a while that this way of conducting the census is really challenging, and I think it's been exacerbated by the pandemic, and the disparities are exacerbated as well. So the hard to count populations are the same populations that are most impacted by COVID, and so I think that I think that we need to have a larger kind of reckoning when the dust has settled. I know there have been former directors who have had a series of conversations about what the 2030 census will look like. And I'm sure this is going to impact those conversations greatly. I think we have to think about climate change as another important factor. and how that's going to impact, operations from the ground up. I think that there are several people who in leadership positions at the Bureau and others, frankly, who believe that administrative data is the way to go, right? If you talk to a lot of folks at the Bureau, you'll hear them say that. But what I think you'll hear a lot of advocacy groups say and others is that, the administrative data really misses a lot of the hardest to count populations. And so that's not a silver bullet. It's not the way that we can move forward necessarily. And so if anything, I think perhaps it raises more questions. But the big point I would stress is that, we need to come together, have a reckoning, have some deep reflection, and start the planning now to factor in, the next pandemic, to factor in climate change, and particularly to think about how those things exacerbate the issues for already hard to count populations.
Wow, that was really well put, Kyla. I mean, you mentioned administrative records, and I think that is where a lot of people like to lean. If you already have records on folks, why not just use them to get that data? And there was a study done in, I want to say 2013, 2014, the US Census Bureau did it. And I was sitting on the NAC, that was my first year on the NAC, that if we can find, we can share it. But what stuck out to me in my mind was when they showed a map of the matches of like how well they could use and match administrative records. What suffered were the coasts. And I could see in California, and it was like one of those maps that are shaded, those areas exactly where administrative records did not work. And it probably overlaid very well with our hardest to count populations. So even if you're using administrative records, there's still going to be a need to do some kind of better outreach, or you're going to miss the same people. So I just wanted to quickly comment on that. But in light of that, I agree, we need to start planning to figure out how to do this better in light of what we're facing now. I'd say the silver lining of all this COVID stuff is that it's highlighted those inequities that I think all of us have pointed out in a way that, my 16-year-old sees it and she's like, oh my God, like we talked about it, but it's just so in everybody's face about the inequalities that are out there and lack of access for a number of things. So much so that she wants to go into public policy. But here's what I would tell leaders who are going to carry forward the next decennial census. Just don't forget the importance of trusted messengers, right? In all of it. And looking at, there's different trusted messengers everywhere. Government is not a trusted messenger, so just knowing that. Always look for making sure you have contingency resources. We were really fortunate back in 2017, 2018, I did a budget request for $40 million. And we ended up at the end of the day with $187 million from the governor and the legislature. But there were so many unknowns. We did say, hey, we can try to plan for them. And so we put a contingency resources away, our own sort of rainy day fund, because we like what popped up, the citizenship question, the fact that it was digital online, there's low broadband, and there could be earthquakes, that kind of thing. So contingency resources, always be building that in. Make sure your funding, if you're using contractors, are structured to create a nimble, dynamic campaign. Don't lock yourself in so much because you never know what's going to happen. And that to just understand that many parts of the country are afflicted by natural disasters and on a regular basis. I think, Kyla, you and I were talking about how while they're starting to do field operations in the South and other areas, it starts to be hurricane season, right? So just be thinking about, something that we thought was going to be a concise 6-month, like all for it is now being really drawn out. But I agree that we need to start putting our heads together and really thinking about, what has happened, what's transpired, and how we're going to be doing the work in the future. And I think that's fascinating. And I'd either love to be a fly on the wall in those conversations or be part of them for sure. But at the end of the day,
part of them for everyone's sake.
Okay. I was going to retire, but that's okay.
Can't.
Yeah, so it's just at the end of the day, it comes down to every single one of you that are listening. Like, you all have a part in this, down to that second grader. You go, girl. You need to be reaching out. And for me, I'd always said, and John knows this, that he was one of the younger people on our California Complete Count Committee. I said, at the end of the day, before all this happened, what's going to make a difference is our youth, right? The youth that see, that understand, that have that personal responsibility that's translated into our communities, and even more so. So be innovative and go for it. Like the world's your oyster here. And if you can do it from home safely, even better.
One other bit I'll just add to that in the silver lining bucket. I think there was already a lot of conversation about what needed to change. I think, and now I think there's general consensus that we can't do the census this way again. And so it's, we really have an opportunity to kind of blue sky it for 2030 and really start, in some ways from the drawing board. And I think that is actually a good thing. So.
Thank you for that. And before we wrap up, do you want to share the best place that we can get more information? Obviously, we can follow 2020census.gov. Is there other CBOs, so community-based organizations, perhaps advocates that are doing a good job of keeping us informed? Do you want to just shout those out?
Yeah, the States Count effort, Beth Link is leading that. So, and then here in California, we've got a number of things on our californiacensus.org, but NALEO is doing incredible things. The Queer the Census for LGBTQ, that's the National Task Force. I don't know, God, there's just so many amazing groups doing really wonderful work out there.
Another group, Census Counts, it's censuscounts.org, has a great number of resources. And then the Census Bureau, in partnership with Rock the Vote, I think I shared with John, has a really fun platform called Creatives for the Count. So if you're a designer, developer, there are great ways to create content that can be shared kind of across media platforms and other places. So I believe it's creativesforthecount.org as well.
And we can send the links then, and John can send it to the folks that are on here.
Fab, and we'll make sure to post the links with the recording so people can easily reference them. And so with that, we're gonna wrap up. I wanna share that I met Ditas 10 years ago, and she has been talking about the power of the trusted messenger. And that has always stuck with me throughout my career in public service. And everyone who's joining us today is a trusted messenger to someone. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we are counting every single person. Just so much is on the line. 1.5 billion or trillion in funding, representation. I mean, this is the time. And yes, this is also a very uncertain time, but we can use our own relational organizing skills to get our neighbors and our family members who perhaps find themselves in the structural or maybe the motivational barriers category. We can help get everyone counted. And it's very simple. I would even say it's less than 10 minutes. I guess depending on family size. I completed my household in maybe about 3 minutes, but it's very, very easy and very, very important. So with that, I want to thank John for leading us today, Ditas and Kyla for such an informative conversation. Again, this talk will be posted on the Ash Center website as well as the Harvard Votes Challenge website for later viewing. And let's see, and we'll make sure to put the resources on the link. And if you want to plug into future events like this, please follow our work at Harvard Ash on Twitter. And lastly, I want to thank the audience for joining us. Thank you so much for taking the time to educate yourself around this. I think we all have a shared goal of making sure that everyone gets counted. And take care.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.